Greetings, greetings, greetings. Welcome to So Much to Talk About. My name is Nabaté Isles, and it's always a pleasure to share facts and viewpoints on the world of sports and feature wonderful guests. And this week is no different. But before I introduce this wonderful gentleman that I have the honor to speaking with, I want to all remind you to check out past episodes of So Much to Talk About on my YouTube channel, which is N as in No, S as in Sam, I as in Indigo, NSI World. So you can check out past interviews and past shows of So Much to Talk About. But this gentleman here I want to introduce is one of the foremost writers in sports. Definitely, he's been someone that has done so much for sports media, and he was a writer and columnist for the New York Times for 25 plus years, and he's covered the NBA Finals, tennis Grand Slams, 10 Olympics, World Series, Super Bowls, men's and women's Final Fours, et cetera, et cetera. And he also authored or edited 8 books, which covered the gamut of sports from baseball, the basketball, and everything like that. And he's covered the New York Knickerbockers for many years. And one of his books is called When the Garden Was Eden, when it chronicled the championship teams of the early 1970s of the Knicks. And he is a recipient of the Curt Gowdy Award at the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts. And he released a recent book called Our Last Season, a writer, a fan, a friendship, about his great bond with lifelong Knicks fan of 45 years, Miss Michelle Musler. It is my pleasure to introduce Hall of Fame writer, Mr. Harvey Araton, on So Much Talk About. How are you, sir?
I'm good, Nabaté. Nice to see you, and great to be with you.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you about your book, Our Last Season. Talk about the bond that you had with Miss Michelle Musler, and how she was a fan, a lifelong season ticket holder for the Knicks for 45 years. Talk more about that friendship and how you were able to create such a great memoir about that.
Well, it's like when you plan a book, and I think I started working on this book in, I think, the fall of 2018. It was a couple of months after Michelle passed away. I don't think I'm giving away the ending of the book, since it is entitled Our Last Season.
Mm-hmm.
And so the vehicle for the book is the last season that Michelle and I shared after, I would say, about 40 years of close friendship. And she became something even much more than a friend. She became like a life mentor and almost like a surrogate parent for me.
Wow.
But it's interesting when you start to work on a book, you have no idea what the world will be like when it finally comes out around 2 years later. And so I'm writing this book about this wonderful friend and mentor, as I mentioned, but also this this woman who sat in the first row behind the Knicks bench for 45 years. Now, since her first year as a season ticket holder was 1973-74, that means she sat there 45 years waiting for a championship that never came.
Oh my goodness. So that was her first after the second championship. That was when she was a season. Oh,
first
wow.
year. So of course the 90s, in the book, I do talk about how the night of Game 5, 1994, the night of the OJ chase, and
yes,
Knicks won Game 5. Patrick played like Bill Russell at the Garden. And I remember, finishing my deadline column and sending it and getting up, picking up my laptop and turning around and bumping right into Michelle. And she said, the first thing she said to me was, "When are you leaving?" And I'm like, "Leaving for where?" And she goes, "Houston, idiot. If I've been sitting here for 20 plus years, and if they're going to win the championship, they're not going to do it without me." And the next day she was on the plane. This is the kind of fan she was. She was there for 6 and 7 and went down with the ship. Yeah. But, so you write a book and it's about this wonderful fan. And there are many at the Garden, and each one, of course we think of Spike Lee as, the face of all Knicks fans, but there are so many who have been there for a generation, who have spent so much money on those, especially courtside seats. And they all have stories. They all have stories behind them. So I'm telling in this book the story of this one woman who, of course, became someone really special in my life. And here we are, the book came out in, late October, early November, and there are no fans in the arenas. I mean, it's
Yeah.
almost inconceivable that, you write something about someone for whom the game has meant so much. And here we are, now into another season. The last one was completed in the bubble in Orlando. Now here we are into a season again, so far without fans in most arenas, although I know the Garden has announced that they'll have 2,000 fans in early March if things, go according to plan.
Yeah.
But it seems like somewhere in here is this greater message. And I think that if we learned anything, obviously we've learned a lot of things during this pandemic, but if we've learned anything about sports, professional sports, it's that how much the fans really mean to these games. I mean, what I've been saying for a while now is that I think what we've learned is that without fans, without the Michelle Musslers of the world and Spike Lees and everyone else, games are just games. They're not events. Without the fans, they're just games. They lose so much, not just live, but even on television. I don't know how you felt watching sports on TV these last bunch of months, whether it was football or baseball or basketball, tennis. There are times when I can focus on the action and just, not kind of see the emptiness all around. But there are most times where I found it to be a pretty stark and sometimes depressing thing to watch, because the essential ingredient, the people who in many ways fund it and who bring it to life are missing. And in some ways, it's accentuated to me just what Michelle was about and made me miss her even more.
Wow. Here with a Hall of Fame writer, Mr. Harvey Araton, on So Much to Talk About. He's covered the New York Knicks for many years and also covered tennis Grand Slams, World Series, et cetera, et cetera. He's one of the best in the business, one of the best ever. And Mr. Araton, now I wanted to talk with you about the pandemic itself and everything, and how it's changed the way of coverage of these events, with no fans being in most of the arenas, and also, media doing, virtual interviews and things like that. Talk about how that has affected you, and what you do, and how deep that's been. And also, how you've been able to circumvent it, go around and keep yourself safe within this pandemic and within this terrible period of what's going on.
Fortunately for me, I'm not, one of the people who regularly cover any team anymore. I mean, I became a columnist and an enterprise long form writer a whole bunch of years ago. But I think it's really created a challenge. I think professional sports, particularly the NBA, which is always very media friendly and providing a lot of access to the players over the years. I mean, increasingly moving away from that over the last, say, 10 or 15 years. I mean, back in the day, when there was only one locker room at the Garden, there was no adjacent training room where the players could hide out. You'd walk in during the 90s and there's Michael Jordan sitting with a towel over his head, an hour before the game, entertaining a half dozen of us.
Yep.
Scottie Pippen laying on the floor across the room. Hey, I think I'll go over and talk to Scottie.
Yep.
That's a little more difficult, these days. The access has been cut down. But I think, these pandemic times where there's no access and everything is done by Zoom, it's really put the onus on reporters to find other things to write about. So, and people, and write about them through people who are accessible. So for instance, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago on the 1-year anniversary of a sad anniversary, obviously, of Kobe Bryant's tragic death.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, what's a way for me to write about Kobe? Obviously, I can't, go have one-on-one interviews with the Lakers or LeBron or people like that. So what I did was I called up Diana Munson, who is the widow of the Yankees great Thurman Munson.
Yes, indeed.
And I interviewed her. I've known her for many years. I visited her on the 10th anniversary of Thurman's death at their home in Canton, Ohio. And I called her and talked to her about what it's like to raise children who had a famous father who died in a very public tragedy. Because the world remembers people like Kobe and Thurman Munson through a highlight reel. And yet, and so she said some very candid and revealing things, which is like, yes, I do not want my children, particularly young children, because her kids were young when Thurman died. And Kobe had, I believe, 2 children under 5 when he passed away. She said that she didn't want her children to think of their father as some kind of superhero. She wanted them to understand that he was a man, a human being with strengths and flaws like any other man.
That's right.
And she said some incredible things about how the wife, the widow of Robert F. Kennedy, Ethel Kennedy, called her after Thurman died to share some of her feelings and what it would be like in the world and how to deal with the grief. She talked about some of the things her kids heard at school, like, you know, my dad found a piece of your father's plane at the airport in Canton, and he saved it as a souvenir, and how her son came home in tears. So by reaching Diana Munson, I'm able to write about Kobe, but using someone who's had a similar experience, or at least a widow who's had a similar experience to what Vanessa Bryant has been going through the past year. So I think it challenges reporters to really think out of the box. The other day, I noticed that Jonathan Abrams, who's one of the Times' current full-time sports writers, wrote a terrific piece about the Charlotte Hornets, about their coaching staff. And it was all about how the NBA, because of the pandemic scheduling, has been having teams play 2 games, like a 2-game series. So like Charlotte was playing Indiana in Charlotte 2 games in a row. And you've seen a lot of that, you know, where, you know, just to ease the burden of travel during, you know, a difficult period. And he wrote about just how the coaching staff has gotten to prepare for a team in a very different way than normally. Normally you're playing Indiana one night, Detroit the next night, and the Knicks the next night. And so he went inside the coaching staff during that 48-hour period, almost hour by hour, in terms of their preparation for the next game. I thought it was a terrific example of COVID era reporting, thinking out of the box and giving readers different insights and compensating for the lack of access that we just don't have.
Wow, that's brilliant. Yeah, and Charlotte is a very interesting team, to say the least. I mean, James Borrego has really done a great job with providing a great offensive pace for that team, and they've been effective on the offensive end for sure. And speaking of Charlotte and LaMelo Ball, like, you know, being, of course, LeVar Ball, the outspoken LeVar Ball, but he's been pretty quiet he's been more mature lately and everything. But what do you think of the excitement LaMelo Ball brings to the NBA? I mean, he's so flashy, and I said to a friend of mine on a past show, saying that he's like, I'm not saying he's the player that Pete Maravich was, but he adds that flashy cachet a la Pete Maravich, you know? So do you think LaMelo Ball could really get better and be a true superstar in this game, the way he's playing and the system that he's in Charlotte?
I do. I think his game is similar, maybe probably flashier, but in terms of where he is in development of his career as a rookie, I think Jason Kidd, because when Kidd came into the NBA, I mean, he was obviously a tremendous passer, very savvy, smart player, but really not much of a shooter.
Right.
And he developed 3-point shot, you know, as he went along, and became you know, he was never like a pull-up 18-foot jump shooter, but he did
was a good spot up shooter.
Spot up 3-point shooter. I think we've already seen some evidence that LaMelo Ball and actually his brother too, Lonzo,
Mm-hmm.
lately has been shooting much better from the line,
Mm-hmm.
behind the line.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, what we're seeing is a guy who is going to become that face of the Charlotte franchise that they really haven't had.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
and I love the NBA, been around it. I grew up in public housing in Staten Island. I was around. I can still remember the day when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, a freshman at UCLA,
Right.
came down to our basketball courts, which was, of course, working class setting, our recreational oasis.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember when he came down to do a clinic with some other local pros from New York. And I once told him about it. And he said, I can't believe you were at that clinic. I was like 13 years old. But, so I've been around the game my whole life. I wish I were taller and could have played at a higher level. It didn't happen. But the next best thing is to be a journalist around it.
That's right.
But
You have that credibility. You have that credibility
yeah.
of being around the game. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course, yeah, but I've always thought what drives basketball as entertainment is passing. Now, we make a big deal. We make so much about slam dunks, and the dunk is obviously an electrically charged kind of play, and the dunk contests have added so much to All-Star Weekend through the years. But the All-Star games that I've gone to, I remember being at one, and had to be sometime in the 90s, and Jason Kidd and John Stockton and maybe one or two others put on a passing show that I remember writing a column saying, this is what drives the sport. It's the vision, magic, all of that. And three-point shooting, of course, now is, you see these guys. I watched a Dallas game the other night against Atlanta, and Dallas was up 4 late in the game. And Trae Young just dribbles the ball up court, takes 2.5 steps past midcourt, and just launches and buries it. And you're like, holy crap, who would have the audacity to do that, right? But he made it, right? So, the three-point shooting is definitely one of those like jaw-dropping things as well. But there's nothing like a guy who sees the floor like nobody else. And it's a gift. You can't teach that. I used to think like sometimes players would get criticized by colleagues of mine for, not passing the ball, not seeing. And I would always say he didn't see it because he couldn't see it. It's not. You have to be truly blessed. In every sport, there are guys who play up and back, and other guys who play, laterally and have the great peripheral vision. I've already seen LaMelo Ball make a couple of passes, that other guys who play in the league, perfectly good point guards, perfectly good, good backcourt players, won't make in their entire careers.
Yep.
Simply because it's a gift that he has. It's vision. It's the ability to see the game geometrically the way other people just can't.
And speaking of that, and speaking with the great Harvey Araton, great writer for New York Times for many years, Hall of Famer, Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame writer here on So Much to Talk About. So, sir, now speaking of that, the Knicks, it's very funny. We're going to go down Knicks history, and they had 2 tremendous point guards with a great vision in the late 80s by the name Mark Jackson and Rod Strickland, both local products. But since those two, the Knicks have not had that point guard, that special individual that can be able to be that floor general on a consistent basis, meaning for years to come. And they ended up losing both those players after 5 years. I would say they ended up trading away Mark Jackson, ended up trading away Rod Strickland. But this current Knicks team, there's a young man by the name of Emmanuel Quickley. What is your take on him? And do you think he could be able to continue his maturation and be that point guard that could conjure up memories of Mark Jackson and Rod Strickland?
Yeah, Rod Strickland, by the way, the godfather to
Kyrie Irving.
Yes. And Mark Jackson, who I've known since high school,
Bishop Lachlan.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mark, unfortunately, Mark you know, didn't quite fit in. It's the turbulence that has always engulfed the Garden. You know, the constant regime changes and coaching changes has always led to a certain kind of instability. So when Al Bianchi was trying to hold on to his job as general manager in the late 80s because he was under fire, he made a trade to try to, you know, salvage his job. So he traded the young Rod Strickland for the aging Maurice Cheeks. It did pay off with a series victory for the Knicks. Cheeks had a great game 5 up in Boston.
That's right. Yeah, you know, the 90 season, 89-90. That's right. Yep.
He played great in that 5th game up in Boston, but like Bianchi kind of sold his soul, you know, for that one. He always hated the Celtics, and they won on the Celtics home floor. Mark, unfortunately, you know, when Riley came in, Riley was a guy who preached tough defense. Mark was not fleet of foot, and he was perceived as something of a defensive liability. But of course, he was a tremendous floor leader and went on to, you know, play really well in Indiana. He's one of the all-time assist leaders in the NBA. But I really like what I've seen of Quickly. You know, sometimes with guys, it's almost hard to quantify what it is that makes them unique and special. And so far, what I've seen in this kid is the ability to kind of get into the seams. You know, he just finds space. And I see a lot of defenders kind of flailing at him from behind or from the side. It's like it's not that he's blazing fast. It's just that he has a knack of it's an intuitive feel for the game. And I think Mark Jackson had that as well. And, you know, is he a spectacular passer? I haven't seen that yet. He's not LaMelo Ball, but I've seen him, you know, in motion, you know, get into the lane and keep his head up and be able to make that smart choice between the floater, which he's adept at, or kind of lay it up on the rim for a guy like Mitchell Robinson. So I really think that they've stumbled upon something here. Maybe I shouldn't say stumble, because they do have a Kentucky, you know, pipeline.
That's right.
You know, and so I think that, you know, he's someone that Knicks fans should be excited about. I hope, you know, you keep hearing, well, you see that they brought in Derrick Rose. And Derrick Rose is still a decent player. Don't get me wrong.
Yes, indeed.
But I hope that as the Knicks go deeper into this season, and there's no reason why they can't contend for at the very least one of those playing positions for the playoffs. But even given the, you know, the state of the conference, there's no reason why they couldn't finish 7th, you know, somewhere in that vicinity. But I hope as they go deeper in that we don't see Thibodeau rely too much on veterans in close games down the stretch, because I want guys like Quickly, Randall, who's not old, obviously he's 26. RJ Barrett.
Maybe, and Toppin, hopefully. Toppin, if he can get better. He still has to show that he can gain that trust to be in the late minutes.
Listen, if it were up to me, I would be giving Frank Ntilikina some minutes. I don't think that Frank
and showcase him. And showcase. You know?
I don't even think Frank has ever been given a full chance to feel like he doesn't have to look over his shoulder. You think of all the point guards the Knicks had in the 4 years that Frank Ntilikina has been in, you know, from Emmanuel Mudiay to Jarrett Jack. I mean, it was like, I once wrote that, like, everybody, they've played everybody but Walt Frazier. And can I make a strong case that he's going to be a really good rotational player? At this point, no. He's been hurt a lot. But I did notice that he had 2 or 3 good games early in the year when he did get hurt. And now that he's back, he can't get any runs. So I understand Tibbs is old school, and he's not a guy. He's not only old school, but he's part of being old school with Tibbs, you know, and having come in under Van Gundy here, you know, back in the early part of the century, is that they have this attitude that, like, hey, they may love you today, meaning management and the city, but they'll turn on you in a heartbeat. So don't buy into the notion that you have time to develop this or that. if you can win now, win as many games as you can. That's the mindset that Thibodeau brings. I just hope he doesn't sacrifice too many minutes and shots in, important minutes, leaning on the veterans. Because you know what? One of the unintended benefits of a pandemic season is that you don't have fans in the building. So the Knicks fans, who are supposedly the most sophisticated, right?
Yeah.
They'll turn on them. The first sign of a 10-0 opposition run, they're booing their heads off at these guys, right? So without fans in the building, there's nobody to boo. If the young guys screw up on a given night, which is a great benefit to them. It's almost like a free season to really give your young players as much experience as you can. Again, balancing that with, the ability of a guy like Alec Burks to hit a 3-point shot in a clutch, or Reggie Bullock, or one of those guys, or now Derrick Rose. I get it. And I get that it's always useful to get into the playoffs and introduce your young guys to that kind of pressure. But I don't want to see them sitting on the bench for the last 5 minutes of a close game, for the sake of 3 more wins. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. And speaking of that, Julius Randle has I believe a player option for next year. It's an option definitely for next season. And do you see, because he's going to command a 4-year, $130, $140 million contract right below max money. Do you see the Knicks even bothering to extend him? And if they don't, who can they get? Because free agents that are out there, who wants to? Giannis, signed a supermax with Milwaukee, so he's there now. Devin Booker still has a lot of years left. Karl Anthony Towns still has a lot of years left. These are the players, that generation, where the Knicks need a superstar in that age bracket. So, can they get that type of person within the next year, especially if they don't re-sign Randle?
Well, I think sometimes, and I think the jury's still out with Julius. I think he's been terrific this year. Obviously, it's interesting that a couple of years ago the Nets had a former Laker who came with clouds over his head in D'Angelo Russell and found redemption in Brooklyn. And now the Knicks have a former Laker who had the same kind of reputation, and now he's finding redemption, letting his talent flow. And I would argue that maybe this is the real Julius Randle, because when you think about his career up to this point, he was on a Lakers team that was not very good.
Yeah.
That was sort of devolving, right?
Yeah. No leadership, really. Yep.
Right. Yep. Constant turnover. Then he went to New Orleans, sort of a similar situation. And I think, like, young players, to get them to really grow into their skills, you need stability. And now Thibodeau, foundational style of play, all that stuff, I think we're seeing, his skills emerge with the sort of the companion of, a system that he can play well in. That said, it's early, and, these things have a way of playing out. But I think as far as other free agents, which ultimately many hear Bradley Beal's name thrown around. So if the Knicks should bring him in, that might change their thinking on Randle. If Quickly develops at a pretty quick rate, no pun intended, but then you have 2 guys who need the ball, right? Who are going to play with the ball a lot and quickly. And let's say they did trade for Bradley Beal. Randle is most effective with the ball in his hands. So, you base your decisions on who your personnel is. But as far as other free agents, let's assume they don't trade for Bradley Beal. A lot of this stuff, as we've seen over the last few years, guys all have opt-outs. So, you never know when Paul George is going to say, you know what, I gave this a shot. I don't, I'm out of here. Or even Kawhi, or even in Brooklyn. I mean, that's a combustible situation. The expectation when Brooklyn made that deal for Harden, even before just getting KD and Kyrie, there was a sense of their time is now. I mean, Kevin Durant's 32 years old. Now adding Harden at the sacrifice of, Jared Allen, Karis LeVert, both of whom I hated to see go. I really like both of them, and both seem to be excellent young men as well. And all those draft picks. It's basically they're Back to the Future, where they, with the Garnett Pierce situation, where it's almost an all or nothing. It's it's boom or bust. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it goes bust, and KD says, "I gave it a shot, and it didn't work out, and you know what? I can't really coexist with Kyrie anymore." And maybe he decides he wants to go elsewhere, and maybe he decides he likes New York, and I'll give the Knicks a shot after all. That's the only way. I mean, a guy who signs for 5 years, who just signed for 5 years, like Giannis, unlikely to move anytime in the next couple of years.
Right, you can't move. That contract.
But the guys with the opt-outs, they're basing, they're going to make the same money no matter where they are. So they're basically saying, like LeBron, after Cleveland the second time, choosing LA, they're making their decisions on, no more on, hey, I want to go in the Hall of Fame and wear this uniform. They're saying, what makes me happiest and gives me the best chance to win now? On who I am at the current moment, and not so much, it's not about loyalty. I mean, this is the kind of precedent I think that LeBron set. It took the empowerment of the star player and took it up to 2 or 3 levels, which I kind of think is cool. I'm all for the players, because as we know, in all sports and for so many years, if management wanted to get rid of somebody, they just traded. The player had no rights whatsoever. This is what free agents. LeBron's done stuff like Michael never did, or Magic or Larry. He's basically said, hey, we fought for free agency. Let's utilize it to the maximum of our potential. And so that's where I think the Knicks have, I think the most important thing for now is to build that nucleus of talent so that when the next guy becomes disenchanted with his current situation, he can say, I'll give the Knicks a look. They've got something going there. Which is basically how Kyrie and KD got to Brooklyn. They saw LeVert, and they saw Jared Allen, and they saw Joe Harris, and they saw Dinwiddie, and they saw an organization that seemed to have a plan, unlike the Knicks, who were just lurching from one coach and president to another. And and also the Dolan factor of his meddling. So guys like KD and Kyrie said, I don't need that.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And that's why I was mentioning names like Devin Booker, Karl Anthony Towns, the John Calipari connection, Worldwide West, CAA, Leon. So that's why I was mentioning, because Karl Anthony Towns was a client of Leon Rose, And I think Devin Booker, he's part of CAA also, I believe. I think. So I'm not sure. But it's interesting, like players like that, I'm sure. I can see the Knicks trying to acquire one of those type of guys, because those guys are right now in the prime of their careers, and hopefully they can get to that next level so they can be at a superstar level. But I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
No, and I think, if the Knicks the arrow continues to point up, the positivity that's been created this season with, Randall and Quickly and RJ and Robinson and the tough defense they're playing, then I think you'll see guys suddenly say, all right, the Knicks are a destination now. And that's how it happens.
That's right. And guess what? Yes, Devin Booker is a client of Jessica Holtz, who is also has a client of Karl Anthony Towns, and they were Leon Rose's client. Interesting. That's
why you just hope you don't hear Jim Dolan's name mentioned at all. The best thing for the Knicks is for Jim Dolan's name to not come up in any conversation. I mean, I have to say that there is a chapter in my book at the end where Michelle is lamenting that, she never did get to see a championship team as close as they did come in the 90s. The chapter is titled Dolan and the Death of Hope. And in it, she talks about, as her career was in human resources, and she had her own executive training company. She trained people like Dolan who were screwing up. And we spent a whole chapter with her talking about how she would have worked with Dolan to make him a better owner if she could have ever had the chance. Of course, that was only a fantasy.
Yeah.
But you don't want to see Dolan involved. Let the basketball people shape the organization. As far as I'm concerned, I don't even see, I think even his media policies are destructive because they lead to things like, not issuing a statement to support Black Lives Matter, all the stuff that gives superstars pause to say, yeah, I'll consider the Knicks. The less they think about Dolan and the more they think about World Wide Wes and Leon Rose and Tom Thibodeau and the young talent they have, the better off the Knicks will be.
Wow, that's a great point. And one last question for you, sir. Such an honor to have you on. So much to talk about. And you've seen so much in sports, in so many different lanes of sports. It's a loaded question, but the one match or game that resonates in your mind to this day that you covered, that you still remember like vividly?
It's an easy one. Game 5, 1984, first round, Knicks at Detroit.
Ooh,
right?
Bernard King.
Right. Now that game would have been played in the Pontiac Silverdome, but the game had to be moved downtown to Joe Louis Arena, where the belonged in the first place, because them leaving downtown Detroit was a sin as far as I'm concerned. And the night of the game, the reason why they couldn't play it, the Silverdome, was that there was tractor pull going on there that night. So game 5 is played at Joe Louis Arena, and the ventilation system kind of goes haywire, and it's like 100 degrees in there. And Bernard King playing with his fingers. Remember, he kept breaking his fingers.
That's right.
And fingers were taped together. And anyway, the Knicks are ahead most of the game, right? And in the last minute and 31 seconds of that game, 1:31, Isaiah Thomas scores 16 points. It's almost like impossible to think of it, right? 16 points. Not only did he score 16 points to pull them to a tie, but he had the ball on the last possession of regulation, drives into the lane. Darrell Walker, who Yubi hated, by the way, because Darrell was, a free spirit, and Yubi just didn't like him. Strips Isaiah. The Knicks go down the other end, miss. Game goes to overtime. Bernard, who averaged like 43 points a game in that series, dominates the overtime. The Knicks win. Isaiah told me a couple of years later that he was so pissed off that they lost that game that he never even showered or got dressed. He got into his car in his uniform and drove all the way to Chicago, where he was from.
That's right. See his mom. Yep.
This was the young Isaiah Thomas. He
That's
said,
right.
I was so ticked off, I just got in my car and drove all the way home. But that night, given the conditions, it was suffocating in there. It was Bernard at his very height. And when Bernard was at his best, he was as fun to watch as anyone in the sport. And
then they took the Celtics to 7 after that. Him and Bird were going at it.
And that was the famous Cedric Maxwell line. This is cable, so I guess I can say it, right? He said before the series started, Cedric Maxwell, who was, again, one of the best quotes in the NBA, said basically about Bernard, "We're going to stop the bitch." And so the first 2 games, they D'd him pretty well. They had this special low post defense they set up so he couldn't get the ball and shoot that quick turnaround. And in game 3, they came back to New York and Bernard scored like 45. And we went to Max and said, "Hey, Max, what do you have to say?" And he goes, "The bitch is back."
And speaking of Cedric Maxwell, one of the most entertaining color analysts in the game, for sure.
one of the great characters of the NBA in the 80s. Often got lost in the Larry, Parrish, McHale type stuff. But Max, and also the MVP of the 81 finals.
That's right. People forget that. Absolutely. For sure. Wow. But Mr. Araton, it was such an honor to have you on So Much to Talk About and go down memory lane and talk about your tremendous career and talk about also what's going on with your perspective on what's going on in the league today. And thank you so much for being on So Much to Talk About. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, indeed. And thank you all for watching So Much to Talk About. Have a wonderful night. God bless. Please stay respectful and be kind to each other during these tough times. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.